If you think talent belongs only to the rich, you're about to be proven wrong tonight. The words cut through the quiet luxury of the Manhattan concert hall as William Harrington stood beside the grand piano, his tailored suit sharp under the golden chandelier light. Around him, elites filled the room, their attention slowly shifting toward the unexpected figure across from him. Emily Carter, a waitress in a simple black and white uniform, stood still near the stage entrance, holding her breath without showing fear. She had not spoken a word since she arrived, yet something about her silence felt heavier than the murmurs in the crowd. William's eyes locked onto her with controlled curiosity, as if calculating a risk he had already decided to take. "You're telling me she actually knows how to play?" someone whispered from the front row, half laughing. William didn't answer. Instead, he gestured toward the piano like it was a challenge written in stone. Emily stepped forward slowly, each movement calm and precise, as if the polished floor beneath her feet meant nothing. She adjusted the bench, sat down, and placed her hands above the keys without hesitation. The room didn't know whether to dismiss her or prepare for something unexpected. William leaned slightly back, confident, almost amused, as if this moment was already decided in his favor. But when Emily finally pressed the first note, it wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and impossible to ignore. The sound didn't try to impress the room, simply changed it. And for the first time that night, William Harrington stopped smiling. The first note still lingered in the air like a question no one was ready to answer. Emily Carter kept her eyes on the piano keys, her posture steady, her breathing controlled, as if the entire room full of Manhattan elites did not exist around her. The silence that followed was not empty, it was heavy, charged, waiting. William Harrington stood a few steps away, his expression no longer mocking but sharper, more focused, as if recalculating everything he thought he knew about the woman in front of him. He had expected hesitation, fear, maybe even a mistake on the first attempt. Instead, he got precision. Slow, deliberate, almost intentional calm. Emily's fingers moved again, adding a second sequence of notes, softer than before but deeper in tone, filling the hall with a quiet emotional weight that made conversations around the room fade one by one. A glass was lowered without sound. A chair stopped moving. Even the faintest background noise of luxury and distance seemed to dissolve. William narrowed his eyes slightly, stepping closer to the piano as if proximity would help him understand what he was hearing. "She is just a waitress," someone behind him whispered, but the words felt uncertain now, as if they no longer held the same meaning. Emily continued without looking up, her focus absolute, her movements not rushed, not hesitant, but shaped by something internal, something learned long before tonight. William finally placed his hands on the edge of the piano, not playing, just observing, as if the instrument itself had shifted ownership without permission. He was used to controlling tempo, controlling outcomes, controlling rooms like this. But the rhythm he was hearing now did not follow instruction. It followed emotion, memory, structure that felt almost invisible, but impossible to ignore. Emily transitioned into a new passage, slightly more complex, and for the first time William's expression changed in a subtle but noticeable way. Not disbelief, not anger, but recognition of challenge. His jaw tightened slightly as he realized she was not repeating anything. She was building something. Each note was not isolated, it was connected, intentional, like she was telling a story without speaking a single word. The audience did not move, as if any sudden motion would break whatever spell had taken hold of the room. William finally exhaled slowly, his confidence still present but no longer absolute. He studied her hands, then her posture, then the way she responded to silence between notes, and in that silence he understood something uncomfortable. This was not improvisation. This was control in a form he did not expect. Emily Carter was not reacting to him at all. She was inviting him into a space where dominance meant nothing, and understanding meant everything. And for the first time since he entered the room, William Harrington felt the ground beneath his certainty shift slightly. The atmosphere inside the concert hall had completely shifted, as if the air itself had grown heavier with meaning. Emily Carter continued to play, her expression unchanged, her focus locked on the piano as though nothing else in the world mattered beyond the language of sound beneath her fingers. The earlier softness in her melody began to evolve, slowly gaining structure, depth, and emotional complexity that no longer felt accidental. It was not about speed or volume, it was about control, and that control now seemed to expand beyond the instrument itself. William Harrington stood close enough now to see the subtle movements of her wrists, the precision of each transition, and the unexpected restraint she used between phrases. He had spent years believing that mastery meant dominance, that the person who played louder or faster held the advantage. But what he was hearing challenged that belief in a way he did not immediately understand. Behind him, the audience remained completely silent, their initial curiosity replaced by something closer to disbelief. No one wanted to interrupt what was unfolding, not even with a breath too loud. Emily shifted into a lower register, the sound now carrying a quiet emotional weight that seemed to reach deeper than performance. It felt personal, as if each note carried intention rather than demonstration. William tilted his head slightly, narrowing his focus, trying to find the structure beneath what he initially assumed was simplicity. But the more he listened, the more he realized there was nothing simple about it. The phrasing was deliberate, the timing intentional, and the silence between notes was as important as the notes themselves. For the first time since the duel began, William adjusted his stance, no longer fully confident, no longer fully detached. A faint tension appeared in his jaw, subtle but visible, as if he was resisting the realization forming in his mind. Emily was not responding to him anymore. She was guiding the entire room into a space he had not prepared for. The music was no longer a challenge between two individuals. It had become something larger, something that removed status entirely and replaced it with presence. A nearby guest leaned forward slightly, then stopped, as if afraid even movement might break the fragile balance in the air. William finally stepped closer to the piano bench, his eyes fixed on Emily's hands, searching for predictability, searching for a pattern he could counter. But instead he found fluidity, adaptation, and a quiet confidence that did not need acknowledgement to exist. Emily transitioned again, this time with a subtle shift in rhythm that caused a nearly imperceptible reaction across the room. It was not shock, not yet, but recognition that something irreversible had begun. William's earlier certainty, once solid and unshakable, now felt distant, as if it belonged to a different version of himself. He did not speak. He did not interrupt. He simply listened, and in doing so, he began to understand that what he had assumed was a test was no longer in his control. The silence inside the concert hall had now become absolute, as if the entire room had collectively agreed to stop existing outside of the moment unfolding at the piano. Emily Carter continued her performance with a calm that felt almost unnatural in its precision, her fingers moving across the keys with a controlled flow that carried both structure and emotion in equal measure. The earlier hesitation from the audience had completely disappeared, replaced by a focused stillness that made every sound feel amplified, every pause feel intentional. William Harrington stood just beside the piano bench now, no longer maintaining distance, his presence quieter than before, as if he was unconsciously respecting the space she had created. His confidence, once sharp and unmistakable, had begun to shift into something more cautious, something reflective. He was no longer measuring her against himself. He was trying to understand her on her own terms. Emily's melody transitioned again, this time introducing a subtle complexity that changed the emotional tone of the entire room. It was no longer a demonstration of skill, but a progression of thought, as if each phrase was answering a question the previous one had only hinted at. William's eyes narrowed slightly, not in judgment, but in concentration, as he followed the structure she was building. There was logic in it, but also something beyond logic, something that did not rely on competition or comparison. A few members of the audience exchanged brief glances, uncertain how to interpret what they were witnessing. Some had entered expecting a performance, others a spectacle, but what they were experiencing now felt closer to a conversation without words. William shifted his weight slightly, his gaze locked on Emily's hands as they moved effortlessly between keys. He noticed how she did not rush even in the most complex transitions, how she allowed silence to exist naturally, without fear of losing control. That silence, he realized, was not emptiness. It was structure. Emily entered a new passage that softened the energy in the room, but deepened its emotional impact. The intensity did not decrease, it transformed, becoming more internal, more reflective. William's expression changed subtly again, the last remnants of his earlier arrogance fading into something more uncertain. He had entered this room believing he was setting the terms of the encounter, but the longer he listened, the more it became clear that the terms had already been set by something far less visible and far more powerful than status. A quiet realization began to form in him, not sudden but steady like pressure building beneath the surface. Emily was not reacting to him at all. She was not trying to match him, exceed him, or even acknowledge his presence as a competitor. She was simply expressing something that existed independently of his expectations. And in doing so, she had removed the foundation of his control without ever touching it directly. William exhaled slowly, his posture easing slightly as he continued to watch her play. For the first time since the challenge was spoken aloud, he was no longer thinking about winning or losing. He was thinking about understanding. And that shift, quiet as it was, marked the beginning of something neither of them had fully named yet. The atmosphere in the concert hall had now fully transformed into something beyond a performance, as if time itself had slowed down to observe what was unfolding between Emily Carter and William Harrington. Emily continued to play with a steady calmness that did not seek attention, yet commanded it completely. Her movements were no longer just technical execution but emotional architecture, each note carefully placed like it carried meaning far beyond the surface of sound. The audience remained silent, not out of confusion anymore, but out of respect for something they could not interrupt even if they wanted to. William stood closer now, his presence no longer dominant in the space but integrated into it, as if the room had quietly redefined his role without asking for permission. His eyes followed Emily's hands with increasing focus, but what had started as analysis had slowly turned into reflection. He was no longer searching for flaws or superiority. He was trying to understand intention. Emily transitioned into a new sequence, softer in tone but deeper in emotional weight, and the shift in the room was immediate. The energy that had once felt like confrontation now felt like revelation. William's expression changed again, more subtle this time, as he realized something that unsettled his earlier assumptions. There was no competition embedded in her playing. There was only expression, pure and uninterrupted, unaffected by external judgment. A faint movement occurred in the audience as someone leaned forward slightly, almost unconsciously, drawn into the progression of sound. Emily maintained her focus, her posture steady, her breathing invisible to those watching. Each phrase she played seemed to answer a question no one had spoken aloud, yet everyone felt. William slowly lowered his gaze toward the keys, then back to her face, noticing how unchanged she remained despite the growing emotional weight in the room. There was no arrogance in her stillness, no performance in her control. It was simply certainty, quiet and unwavering. For the first time since the challenge began, William felt something unfamiliar rising within him. Not frustration, not defeat but clarity. He had assumed that mastery was measured by control over others, by the ability to define outcomes before they happened. Yet what he was witnessing now could not be controlled, only experienced. Emily's music began to build once more, not in volume, but in emotional layering, creating a depth that seemed to stretch beyond the walls of the hall. William's stance softened slightly, his hands no longer resting in a posture of authority, but hanging naturally at his sides. He was no longer the center of the room. He was part of it. And in that realization, something inside him shifted permanently. He had entered this moment believing he would test her limits, but instead, he was discovering his own. The final note of Emily Carter's performance lingered in the air longer than sound should have been able to survive, as if the entire concert hall was holding on to it, unwilling to let go. For a brief moment there was nothing. No applause, no movement, only a silence so complete it felt intentional. Emily's hands rested gently above the keys, her posture unchanged, her expression still calm, as if she had simply completed something ordinary, rather than something that had reshaped the entire atmosphere of the room. William Harrington remained standing near the piano, but his presence no longer carried the same weight it once did. The confidence that had defined him at the beginning of the evening had not vanished suddenly, but dissolved gradually, replaced by something quieter and far more reflective. He looked at Emily not as a challenge anymore, but as a question he had not known how to ask. The audience began to move again, slowly at first, almost uncertain whether the moment had truly ended. Then one by one, the first sounds of applause emerged, soft but growing, filling the hall with a sense of collective realization rather than celebration. Emily stood up from the piano bench without haste, adjusting her posture with the same quiet control she had carried from the beginning. She did not bow dramatically, nor did she seek attention. She simply acknowledged the moment with stillness, as if the performance had been something shared rather than something won. William stepped slightly closer, his voice not immediately finding words. When he finally spoke, it was lower than before, no longer carrying authority but curiosity shaped by humility. He looked at the piano, then back at her, as if trying to understand how something so unexpected had unfolded in front of him without resistance or force. Emily met his gaze briefly, not with superiority, but with calm understanding that did not require explanation. Around them, the guests continued to react, some still frozen in disbelief, others beginning to speak in quiet tones as they processed what they had witnessed. But William remained focused on her. For the first time, he did not think about control or outcome or dominance. He thought about perception, about how easily certainty could be mistaken for understanding. Emily gently closed the piano lid, the sound soft but final, marking the end of what had been shared between them. William exhaled slowly, as if releasing something he had carried longer than he realized. The challenge that had brought them here no longer felt like a competition, felt like a turning point, and in the quiet that followed, neither of them moved immediately, as if both understood that something had changed in a way that could not be undone. The applause inside the concert hall had softened into scattered echoes, as if the room itself was unsure how to fully return to reality after what it had just witnessed. Emily Carter stood beside the closed piano, her hands relaxed at her sides, her breathing steady, her expression unchanged. She did not look at the crowd, nor did she seek acknowledgement. It was as if she had already moved past the moment while everyone else was still trying to understand it. William Harrington remained a few feet away, no longer positioned as an opponent or even an observer, but as someone caught in quiet reflection. His posture was different now, less rigid, less certain, as though the structure he had built his identity on had been quietly adjusted from within. He looked at Emily with an expression that no longer carried evaluation, but recognition. Not of talent alone, but of depth he had failed to anticipate. Around them, guests slowly began to speak again, their voices low and fragmented, like fragments of a collective realization still forming. Some shook their heads slightly, others stared at the piano as if it had changed into something unfamiliar. Emily finally turned slightly, not toward the audience but toward William. Their eyes met for a brief moment, not as challenger and opponent, but as two people who had crossed a boundary neither had fully named. William took a slow breath, then stepped closer, his voice measured but no longer guarded. When he spoke, it was not with command, but with sincerity shaped by uncertainty. Emily listened without interrupting, her calm presence unchanged, yet attentive in a way that acknowledged his shift. The distance between them felt different now, no longer defined by status or intent, but by understanding that had emerged without instruction. William glanced once more at the piano, then back at her, as if searching for a final anchor to the version of himself that had entered this room earlier. But it was no longer there in the same form. Emily gently placed her hand on the edge of the piano, not as a gesture of possession but as closure. The instrument that had once symbolized challenge now felt like a shared point of truth. William nodded slightly, not in defeat, but in acceptance that did not require words. The energy in the room continued to settle, the tension dissolving into something quieter and more thoughtful. Emily stepped back from the piano, preparing to leave the stage area, while William remained still for a moment longer, as if allowing the realization to fully land. What had begun as a challenge had not ended in victory or loss, but in perspective. And in that final silence, both of them understood that nothing between them would remain exactly the same after this moment. The silence inside the private dining room felt heavier than any conversation that had come before it, as if the air itself was waiting for someone to decide what truth would survive the moment. The billionaire remained still, his attention locked on the waitress who stood with calm precision near the edge of the table, her hands resting naturally at her sides, her expression steady but no longer invisible. Something had shifted, not in volume or movement but in perception. He was no longer looking at her as someone passing through his world. He was looking at her as someone who had always been standing just outside the frame of it, observing more than she ever revealed. She did not rush to fill the silence. She let it exist, controlled it, shaped it without speaking a single unnecessary word. That alone unsettled him more than any argument could. He had spent his life in rooms where silence meant hesitation or weakness, but here it felt intentional, like a language he had never been taught to understand. The moment stretched until he finally exhaled slowly, lowering his gaze for the first time since the confrontation began. When he spoke, his voice was quieter, stripped of the earlier confidence that usually filled every space he entered. He asked her how long she had known. She did not pretend not to understand. She simply answered that she had known enough, long before anyone decided to ask the right questions. The words were simple, but they carried weight, not accusation, not emotion, only fact. It was that restraint that made it difficult for him to dismiss. He leaned back slightly, the polished surface of control that he wore every day beginning to show faint fractures. For a brief moment, he looked less like a man who owned companies, and more like someone trying to reassemble his understanding of reality. He asked her why she never used what she knew for herself. Her answer came without hesitation. She said knowledge was never something she considered as currency, only as responsibility. That response lingered in the space between them longer than anything else. Outside the glass walls of the restaurant, the city continued its indifferent motion, headlights sliding across wet pavement, distant horns marking time for people who had no idea what was unfolding just a few floors above them. Inside, the dynamic between them had shifted into something unspoken but undeniable. He realized that every assumption he had made about her had not been broken in a single moment, but carefully undone over time, piece by piece, without her ever needing to announce it. She had not exposed him. She had simply stopped allowing him to misunderstand her. That distinction struck deeper than criticism ever could. The billionaire finally stood, not in confrontation, but in acknowledgement. For the first time, he was not measuring her against his world. He was reconsidering the shape of his world entirely, and in that quiet recalibration, neither of them moved to fill the silence, because both understood that what had changed could not be reversed by words alone. The moment the translator's final sentence faded, the room did not erupt. It collapsed into silence so precise that every small sound suddenly felt amplified. The soft movement of glass against wood, the distant hum of the ventilation system, even the subtle shift of breathing around the table. The billionaire CEO did not speak immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on the waitress, as if trying to align what he had just heard with every assumption he had built about the negotiation in front of him. The German delegation across the table looked unsettled, their expressions caught between confusion and hesitation, as though the foundation of the deal had quietly tilted without anyone noticing the exact moment it happened. The waitress stepped forward slightly, not invading space, not demanding attention, but positioning herself with calm certainty. She looked at the CEO and then at the translator, her voice steady as she repeated the exact phrasing that had just been misrepresented, this time in flawless German, precise and unaltered. The difference was immediate. The tone of the German representative shifted, their posture straightening as recognition replaced doubt. The CEO's expression changed slowly, not into anger, but into calculation mixed with disbelief. He turned his head slightly toward the translator, asking for clarification, but the translator hesitated, stumbling over words that now sounded weak even to himself. The waitress did not raise her voice. She simply added context, explaining subtle phrasing that carried entirely different contractual meaning, the kind of detail that could change obligations, ownership terms, and financial exposure in ways that no one at the table could ignore. The CEO finally leaned back, one hand resting against the edge of the table, his gaze no longer divided between parties but fully locked on her. He asked her directly how she knew the nuance so precisely. She replied that she had once studied translation and international law, but never completed the program due to circumstances that required her to step away from it. There was no emotion in her explanation, only clarity, as if she were stating a simple fact about the weather. The German representatives began speaking among themselves quietly, recalibrating the discussion without waiting for permission. The translator lowered his eyes, no longer attempting to defend his earlier interpretation. The CEO raised his hand slightly, signaling a pause in the negotiation. For the first time since the meeting began, he was not controlling the direction of the conversation. He was absorbing it. He asked her why she had not corrected earlier mistakes before this moment. She responded that she only intervenes when accuracy becomes more important than silence. That answer settled heavily in the space between them. The CEO studied her for a long time, the environment of the room fading behind his thoughts, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that the outcome of a multi-million-dollar deal had just shifted because someone he had barely acknowledged had chosen to speak at the exact moment truth could no longer be ignored. The German delegation finally spoke again, not with frustration, but with renewed seriousness, asking to revisit specific terms directly. The translator remained silent. The CEO nodded slowly, acknowledging the shift, then looked back at the waitress. His tone changed when he spoke again, no longer transactional, but measured with respect he had not offered before. He asked her to stay for the remainder of the discussion. She did not hesitate, but she also did not appear pleased or proud. She simply agreed, as if remaining in the room was not a privilege, but a responsibility she had already accepted the moment she corrected the first mistake. And as the negotiation resumed with new precision and sharper awareness, it became clear that the balance of power in the room had permanently changed, not through force or status, but through a single voice that refused to allow error to become agreement.